It's all about the story that Donald Trump wants to tell about himself and about his movement. Then that is the power that it gains. It doesn't matter what the facts are, but if you can create the set of visuals that will support that and make it seem real, and then back it up with some hand-handed AI videos, then that is what informs that idea that he is in fact succeeding in solving a problem that doesn't exist because he's able to essentially perform it on TV.
Welcome back to The Tea with me, Myriam François, the show where we serve truth strong and questions even stronger. Before we dive in, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss an episode of The Tea. If you want to support the show and help shape future episodes, join our Patreon community. Think of it as the resistance. Plus, if you're in our top tier, you'll get access to ad-free episodes. The link's in our bio. In this episode, we're diving into resistance at a time when authoritarianism is on the rise. 9 months into his second term, President Donald Trump has intensified what many call a war on America's core freedoms. The so-called land of the free now ranks 57th on the 2025 World Press Freedom Index, its lowest ever, and a steep drop of 10 places since 2000. Nearly 40% of Americans now say democracy no longer works, and after nearly 7 million marched in last weekend's No Kings protest, we're also seeing ICE adopting almost paramilitary-style tactics on the streets, while campaign merch for Trump 2028 is already hitting the shelves. To help us unpack this moment, I'm joined by Tad Stoermer, public historian, teacher, and storyteller. You might know Tad's viral TikToks, where he spotlights historical parallels to our present crisis. He spent a career tracing the roots of American democracy, and his latest book, A Resistance History of the United States, asks what happens when democracy bends and what real resistance looks like. As a visiting scholar at the Center for American Studies in Denmark and a lecturer at Johns Hopkins, Tad brings both scholarship and lived insight into the long arc of dissent. So, what's really happening? Is this a crisis of democracy, or has something even darker begun? And what can the lessons of history teach us about standing up in an age of creeping control? Tad, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here. Dark times?
Yes.
Certainly feels like dark times. What is a public historian, and what is the role of resistance history at this time?
A public historian is someone who takes our understanding about the past, why things happened the way they did, and actually apply them in the present. Try to bring audiences along, modern audiences, to understand how history is in fact relating to their lives in usable ways. Academic history, you study why things happened the way they did to try to understand them in that context. Public historian takes that and then applies it to today.
Hence your TikTok videos.
Hence my TikTok videos. You got to go where people are. And in engaging in digital media with broader audiences, speaking their language, understand what's relevant to them, and in fact, the kind of things that are moving in their lives, to try to make sure that they're understanding how everything has a history to it. And to be able to understand that history more helps them understand what it is that they need to do about it, how they can change it, how they can make it better.
And you are technically an academic in exile today. Your work has been identified specifically as a problem by the US administration. Can you give us a little sense of the backdrop to why you're now living and working out of Denmark?
Well, because I'm considered anti-American for being an Army veteran and somebody who has worked on the history of the American Revolution for his whole life. I find that to be a little bizarre. But my work was identified fairly early on by the administration in this term as being representative of kind of anti-American education that they believe that American college students are receiving, and therefore, as a part of some sort of absurd leftist positioning in American scholarship, that it is twisting young Americans to hate America. And so my work's been identified particularly about that, even though I have never really taught that. I mean, who teaches that? You try to teach the honesty of history, how we got from then and now, not really being a right or a left thing. It's really about what did happen or what didn't happen. But that runs afoul of those who want to grab a narrative and distort that narrative in order to legitimize their claims to power and their purchase and their reach for more. When you run against that, then you're anti-American, anti-their America. And so my work was identified fairly early on by the administration, particularly when it was first reaching out against American universities to attach funding to a level of control over what was being taught in the classroom.
You're referencing here the use of funding by the US administration to essentially, limit the extent to which different departments can teach various subjects. I mean, is that what's happening in American universities right now?
And it's even worse now. It's happening in a pervasive way. The leverage of funding versus the kind of other threats that are coming out of the administration, the legal threats that are going to haul universities into court over the kind of policies, whether particularly DEI policies and other kinds of things. What we're seeing now is the absolute capitulation of almost, in many ways, of almost all American universities. It might not be the big name ones, the Harvards, the Johns Hopkins, the University of Virginia's, the Columbias, the Penns, but it is reaching down to mid-size and to smaller universities, to everybody that is connected in some way to any kind of federal funding that is used as leverage by this administration to influence anything from admission policies to the kind of courses that show up on a curriculum.
And so just to be clear, are you concerned for your safety and welfare as somebody trying to teach around these things in America right now? I mean, you're living in Denmark. Are you able to go home and, not worry about going home to the US?
Well, I can worry about going home to the US, but I didn't go to Denmark because I needed to get out of what was a dangerous situation. I got my family out of the United States when I received an email with a picture of my son's preschool. That's when I said they're not doing this.
Wow, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, so it took me a week to get them from Cape Cod to Denmark. I can manage. My son's 4. That's not happening.
Right, and until now who was behind that email?
Well, it's all the far right people. I ended up on these lists that the far right use, whether it's libs of TikTok and things like that, that specifically target folks like me. But it's not the kind of targeting that I really have to worry about. I can take care of myself, but it's reaching your family and combined with those kind of threats. What people who do the kind of work that I do, people who do the kind of work you do, Myriam, that you get this kind of stuff all the time. What is different over the last year is the clear identification of a level of capacity for the far right, on the hard right, to in fact follow through on those threats. Those threats have been there and empty for a very long time. Now they've taken on a much different valence where they can actually execute, and that's not a mistake that anybody wants to make.
And also, I want to ask, has your institution had your back in this regard? Because I'm aware that there's been a lot of debate about the role of institutions in supporting scholars through what many see as an assault on academic freedom. You've just described an actual threat to your family's well-being. How supportive has the institution been of you through this period?
The university has been silent about most of this. The idea at first when I was targeted was mostly about keep your head down, stay quiet, let's go ahead and wait and see what this looks like on the other side for everybody, with the idea that this is going to be some sort of temporary lull rather than a structural systemic transformation. As that has gone month after month after month, the idea is that I would stay off the teaching schedule. I'm still on the faculty at Hopkins. But I am not on the teaching faculty. I'm not on the teaching schedule, and there is really no prospect that I'm going on the teaching schedule anytime soon.
Okay, so you've effectively been disappeared from the institution's teaching roster.
Yes, which makes me glad to be at the University of Southern Denmark.
I can only imagine. Well, look, you're one of a few public historians online who's been sounding the alarm about what you describe as a post-democracy moment that we've not seen before in modern history. That's quoting you directly. Can you tell us on what basis you're calling this a post-democracy moment?
Well, all of the institutions that support democracies in countries around the globe have collapsed. Democracies are informed not just by institutions, but by a range of beliefs, and by sort of a set of common principles that people will adhere to, a set of fairly coherent values, but that's all based upon essentially of a strategy of hope. that everybody is going to essentially play by the rules. And that's what democracy is based on. There are forms to it, such as, I mean, obviously a free press, and obviously an idea of situational equity. But for the most part, it's about the belief that everybody is going to play by the rules of discourse, by the rules of principle. That what we have seen rapidly and nakedly has collapsed. That when in thinking about that, I think about the much flogged Fukuyama argument from 1989 that the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union was the end of history. That it was in his point that it was the triumph of democracy over other competing systems such as communism, and that, even he admitted, was an insufficient explanation for how history was working then. There was no triumph of democracy. But what we're seeing over the last year is what is next, when not just did democracy not triumph, but when democracy itself as a reliable system of governance, how that has collapsed. And now we're in a point where there is no next. We're in this transitional period where everything has crumbled. You can't really rely on democracy because all of the principles that have underpinned strong democracies, such as rule of order, such as this commitment to norms, do not hold when threatened. And that's, I think, what has been destabilizing for a lot of people who not just do the work I do, but for even for younger people who were kind of sold this idea that democracy is somehow inherently strong because it's based upon the will of the people, the consent of the governed. Well, if that's not protected, if that's not supported, if there's not an "or else we will do X to defend it" behind it, then you can see how quickly it can go away.
We've seen U.S. presidents, contravene international law more than once. We've seen them at times, take, deliberate strikes at the opposition in different ways. So, is the Trump presidency really that unusual?
It's that unusual for white people in America. Throughout most of American history, it has not been unusual for anybody who wasn't white in American history. That particularly for the first, what we call the First Republic, the first 80 years of United States history. If you were Black in America, then this is a fairly familiar person that you're looking at in terms of the American president. Somebody who is using the power of the office to forward the interests of a relatively few people. Which just happened to be white members of the establishment, but that was what was considered the United States. Unfortunately, a fifth of the population would have found this very familiar. That what we think about in terms of authoritarian measures, tyranny, when you're talking about a fifth of the population that is kept in abject bondage and brutality, then this looks strikingly familiar to them. This is a clear part of American history. What is different is that this is now happening in terms of the self-interest of the White House. This is happening even in opposition to white Americans. And that's where the instability is coming from. White Americans are uncomfortable. White Americans are finding this to be different because they are not in a position of having their interests being threatened by whoever's in the White House. They're in the position of having their interests being served by the guy in the White House, regardless of who else it's being applied against. That's new. That's different. That's unprecedented.
So Trump's elected on a America First ticket, right? He's, campaigning on the basis that he's out here to represent the white working class predominantly, let's be honest. And he has been fairly popular. This is where I think it's getting confusing for some of us watching this from the outside. As of now, his overall approval rating is 41%, according to the polls. The vast majority of Americans, 81%, see crime as a major problem in large cities. And about half of US adults, 53%, say they approve of Trump's handling of crime. So when I see Trump deploying the National Guard to Washington, D.C., L.A., Chicago, Memphis, and Portland, I look at this and I think, oh, this is quite scary. But it seems like he actually may have public support for this. So isn't Trump just doing what the public wants?
They're doing what a particular part of the public wants. The point to really keep in mind about everything that Trump does, but also everything the way that Steve Bannon and the folks on the far right are managing this, is that they create a narrative And it's that narrative that serves their political ends. And so the narrative has this populist thrust to it that directly addresses the kind of threats that poor white Americans, who they want to mobilize politically, think is impacting their lives: crime, immigration. And the two are deeply connected in that story. So you present the story and you create the problem, and then you create the solution to the problem, and then you create the visuals to be able to show that you are solving the problem in a way that they can relate to, something that is muscular, something that is aggressive, that shows the power of the United States in this exceptional way. It's entirely a construct. We know those crime rates aren't there. We know that we know that that undocumented immigrants do not engage in criminal activity any more than do Americans. In fact, it's almost always less, particularly in terms of violent crime. We know that crime rates in the inner cities that he's talking about, whether that's DC or Chicago, that they are in fact not accelerating, that they're in fact decreasing. DC was at the lowest violent crime rate in 25 years. That these kind of numbers, the facts don't matter when it runs into their feelings, and it's the feelings that the narrative needs to serve. And so when you understand that it's all about the story that Donald Trump wants to tell about himself and about his movement, then that is the power that it gains. It doesn't matter what the facts are, but if you can create the set of visuals that will support that and make it seem real, and then back it up with some hand-handed AI videos, then that is what informs that idea that he is in fact succeeding in solving a problem that doesn't exist because he's able to essentially perform it on TV.
Wow. Okay, so we'll get into this narrative war very shortly. But speaking of facts, this idea that the National Guard needs to be deployed was justified by the Trump administration on the basis of lawlessness, right? These cities are so dangerous. And as you point out, that's not always tallying up with the statistics around what's happening there. But certainly only one of the cities where we've seen the National Guard deployed is one of the top 10 most violent cities in America, and that's Memphis. So how do you explain the function of the National Guard on the streets if it isn't actually about law and order?
Well, it's just about the visuals, right? It's two things, right? Because he can sort of accomplish the law and order storytelling through ICE, and he's been deploying that at will, and that's fairly clear. But the idea that he can deploy the National Guard has a very particular meaning in the United States, that he can in fact convey the United States military on the ground, that he can convey another layer of executive authority, of a unilateral authority, that is, I think, less about the broader story of law and order than the broader story that he can send to a potential opposition, that there is anything that they could do to stop him. That the National Guard can go to a place like Chicago is a good example of this. It doesn't matter to Donald Trump whether the National Guard actually is deployed on the streets of Portland or deployed on the streets of Chicago. Not in terms of what it is he wants to achieve. He needs to show that he can send the National Guard there and that they can be there and nobody can make them leave. And there, but for the grace of whatever he says they're going to do, it's up to him to decide that that's what it is, the role that they're going to play on the street. This is more a demonstration of the potential for unilateral authority than it is about the law and order narrative.
Okay, could we just unpick the word unilateral authority? Yeah. Plain speak for that, please.
That he can absolutely engage in authoritarianism at will.
And this, what we're seeing, this National Guard deployment is basically a flexing. He's flexing.
That's exactly what it is. And flexing, and to be able to use, this is a key point of it, to be able to show that it is not only legal, that it's constitutional. Once he flexes and he gets the challenges as we've seen in California and Oregon and Illinois, and that starts to run through the federal court system. And the higher it gets, the more it gets approved, the more it gets legitimized and reinforced that, yes, it is his authority. That's what he wants. Mm-hmm. And that flexing then gets reinforced. The flexing then gets legitimized until it reaches the Supreme Court, when they're going to come down with the final word, which is that it is constitutional. You can do that. This is the imperial presidency.
Oof. So let me ask you about this. Why the need to manufacture a crisis? Because actually, it's not like there's a shortage of crises in America right now. So a Pew Research Center study this year reported that 2/3 of Americans say the cost and access of American healthcare is a very big problem. At the same time, economic anxiety is high. 60% of Americans say they worry a great deal about the economy. 56% are very worried about inflation. Reuters reported that 70% of Americans fear the rise of AI will lead to permanent job losses, which we know is already happening. So why the need to invent a crisis, Tad? It's like there are plenty of crises to deal with here.
But those crises he can't do anything about. I mean, he has shown the capacity to be able to throw money at all kinds of things. I mean, he can get a cash buy to Argentina, right? I mean, he can throw money at all kinds of things. There is a political will to get things done, such as invest money in vastly expanding ICE and other kind of measures like that. But the kind of things that he needs to do for the basic things that most Americans worry about, such as healthcare, he's not willing to do because that cuts into other interests. It is much easier to invent a bigger crisis and come up with a perceived solution to that crisis that will distract people from the other things. Even things like inflation can sort of blame on other factors. But the main thing about this is that this is a crisis that it can serve this dual purpose of serving the political interests of the far right movement, this coalition of nationalists that are what's behind the administration right now.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, Ted. So if he's not in service to the working class, or certainly the white working class that he made all these promises to about making America great again, and that clearly a lot of people did buy into, who is he in service to?
Well, that's a good question, because the idea that the folks in the United States that are really behind the regime are this fairly small group of people on the far right, this group of Christian nationalists and white nationalists who have this very clear idea of what America should be and can be, whether poor white people recognize it or not. But it's this small group of people who have this vision of America that is drawn from their understanding of its founding, this idea of a city on a hill, this idea that it is a Christian nation that has a particular role to play in the world today, that it comes from a kind of divine promise. That is a major part of the group that is in fact supporting him, regardless of what anybody else is doing. And so even if no one is going to associate a lot of deep thinking to Donald Trump about anything, but what he does understand is that his political interests, but it's also his financial interests, are tied to support from that group. Those are the people who put him where he is and that are keeping him there. Those are the people who Steve Bannon has organized. Those are the people who Stephen Miller represent. Those are the people who Charlie Kirk represents. Those are the people who are actually behind this regime, and which is why getting rid of Donald Trump doesn't solve the problem.
Well, so you recently made a video explaining what Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu learned from World War II. Can you share those insights and why you decided to, compare those three men?
Those three men are the representations of authoritarianism today. They're the same person. They look at authority in the same exact way. They see that their personal interests are represented by the power structures that they are able to control, and that the weakness of any kind of forces that are aligned against them are based upon the idea that democracy doesn't work, that multilateralism doesn't work, that the kind of gentleman's agreement that, if we go back to comparing them to Mussolini and Hitler and Franco in the 1920s and 1930s, the lesson that they learned is that when you push back against democracies, then they collapse. Then there is no or else when people want to communicate in strongly worded communiques or diplomatic engagement or some sort of broader sense of a rules-based system, that there are meaningful ramifications if you don't play by those rules. What they did, starting with Mussolini, is that you test the rules. Mussolini in Ethiopia, you test the rules. You see how they're going to push back. You see whether the League of Nations will in fact fulfill its pledges to go ahead and protect democracies around the world and protect freedom. When you see that they don't, and when they respond with words, when they're not going to respond to action, then you realize that you can stick around. You realize that you can, in fact, go a little further. And those are the lessons that all three of them learned, Mussolini and Hitler and Franco. And those are the lessons that Putin and Trump and Netanyahu, all to a certain extent, and I'm not sure Trump's really a student of anything, but students of World War II, that we're at a point in which those lessons had not been tested post-World War II. That the idea that these institutions had been created after World War II in order to make sure that the problems that authoritarianism posed in the 1930s and 40s would not be proposed again, that nobody had really tested them. And so when Putin is able to invade Ukraine and there being no pushback, just words, just strongly worded communiques, just diplomatic endeavors, sanctions, just economic penalties, the idea that, well, they can actually just wait it out because democracies require the consent of the governed. That consent will erode over a period of time. People get tired, especially when the kind of things that they're putting into it, more money for more weapons that you're sending by proxy to Ukraine, without any kind of change in that story. If they can hold the line, then they will get what it is that they want.
Across Europe, even here in the UK, in America, we're seeing this rise of support for movements which seem to have similar kind of ideas about the world, in particular strongman leaders, a sort of ethno-nationalist bent to them. How do you explain that?
I think that it's a little too early to write the history on this. Historians are terrible fortune tellers. We're even worse journalists. But we can see patterns and try to identify what those common elements are. And sort of, as you pointed out, that are responding to the kind of messages that are being put out by, folks in the far right, by Nigel Farage or Donald Trump or Benjamin Netanyahu, that are all appealing to what I think is at the core of it, which is the power of ethno-nationalism, this sort of sense of an almost tribal identity that is exclusive and it is exclusionary. It can have whatever valence you want. It can be in the name of religion. It can be in the name of other kinds of nationality, but it still comes down to the same basic core elements that activate people as an us versus the others. And whatever we can do to exclude those others and to protect what we believe is ours by a kind of unearned privileged right, a kind of constructed right, then that is something that you're willing to associate with and you're willing to protect against your material interests. So that could be, you could be in Israel, you could be in the United States, in Ohio, and you could think that, well, my actually material interests and the kind of things that I personally believe are not being served by these people who are deploying all of these forces in order to be able to achieve their own ends. But if I can identify that my own identity, my own sense of self, my own sense of worth as an American, is aligned with what it is that they're doing, then that's a greater value for me, especially if it's exclusive. If there is an implication that I'm going to receive something as a result of this, that I might not otherwise get because it's threatened by the brown people.
Well, let me ask you about this tribalism idea, because the American professor Jason Stanley, in his book, How Fascism Works, explains that fascism thrives by creating a division between us and them, which you've just alluded to, by basically pushing the idea that the problems in a nation society are caused by outsiders or minorities. And we obviously have seen Trump recently designate the Antifa, the anti-fascist movement in America, as a domestic terrorist organization. That feels like a significant escalation. He's gone further, calling Democrats enemies from within. That's a quote. We've been hearing the term illegal alien. That's a narrative we've heard for a while now, or the radical left communists. What is the function within this current moment of creating these political camps, these ideas of us and them?
It is a powerful tool. And it is this idea that essentially you are in a never-ending battle against threats to who you are. So you identify who you are in these very clear terms based upon mostly immutable characteristics, right? But that if you can make sure that you are essentially establishing a certain group that is under constant threat from these external forces, and you are always then acting defensively, you are at risk, you are at war, this is a fight, then that is what will keep you scared. and keep you looking to the people who will protect you. If you're always in a defensive posture, then you need to look at the people who are going to protect you from the big bad wolf.
But haven't there always been, these opposing sides and big bad wolves? Hasn't there always been a narrative of us versus them? What is distinctive about this particular narrative?
Well, not partly because it's a massive lie. All of these things that you pointed out, none of it's true. All of it's a construct. And I'm not saying a construct in a kind of metaphysical sense. It is just a basic lie. Illegal immigrants. Undocumented immigration in the United States is not a criminal offense. It's a civil offense. It is punished by a fine. It is not a criminal offense. There is no such thing as an illegal alien in that sense. There is no such thing as a violent crime scourge that is being driven by illegal aliens. It's not true, but you create the fiction to show that there is an invasion, that there is a force that is coming after you. You got to define who you is. But the other part of that, so that will get you against the people who in American history have always been identified easily and quickly, as you point out, as the other. People who are not white, people who are not Christian, people who are not white. They have been always easily identified as being the other in that kind of narrative. The trick now and what is new is identifying other white people. And again, this is part of the how of the instability that's been created, is that there are white Americans who are now uncomfortable about Donald Trump, but there are white Americans that are now being targeted by a Donald Trump as for the first time being outside of the us. So that us has become more and more narrow. White Americans have been very comfortable for a very long time, which is why Jim Crow has lasted for so long, which is why there's been less movement on civil rights and for other kinds of protection and expansion, because white people essentially were fairly comfortable with their dominant place in the American body politic and the political culture. However, now, because Donald Trump sees that kind of white unity, can we call it that, as being insufficient to go ahead and maintain and expand his control, that he's got to be able to identify an other within white people. And that's where Antifa comes from. Antifa is not anything in the United States. I'd have a card if it was. It doesn't exist. It is essentially a political persuasion at best. It is in no way an organized opposition. We don't have an organized opposition in the United States. What did we did? But what is essentially, I don't want to say it's genius about this, but what is strategically significant about this is that it can be anybody that you say it is. So if you are part of the radical left, and as you pointed out, you hear this rhetoric all the time, you assign everything to the radical left. The government shutdown is part of the radical left, the Marxists. These words have lost all meaning. They can't tell you what Marxism is. What they can tell you is that people who support them politically will associate that with the bad guy, with communism, with the longer form, big bad wolf from the post World War II era. They fit that into cultural tropes that already exist, that have meaning for that story. And so that bigger part, which is the new part, is being able to go ahead and identify white people in America as being the other two. And that means that you're even in a more tenuous defensive position, because then the enemy could be anybody.
So let me ask you about this idea of Trump being a fascist, because this is a term that is highly contested, of course, online. And can you give us a sense of why that is, if it is, an accurate term?
I don't know that it's accurate. I don't think that we know yet the kind of authoritarian that he is. He's such an opportunist. And I think fascism has a fairly clear set of ideological components to it. I think that Mussolini could be clear about sort of the strength of the state, sort of in the hands of the individual, kind of, and how authority is deployed. I don't think the way that Donald Trump is wielding authority, because it is more broad than just the individual. This is a regime-based form of politics. So it's certainly authoritarian. So sort of he's wielding certain things, and he has his hobby horses. He can knock down the White House all day long and erect monuments to himself. But for the most part, what we see as being the structural changes in the United States, through the judiciary, through the federal government, and the way that they are in fact winning the cultural war too, by extending it into universities, by extending it into the media. That cultural war was won fairly quickly. That is not the work of one person. That's the work of of this nationalist regime. And so when we think about authoritarianism that's being wielded by a regime rather than by an individual or a cadre, then we're into other kinds of authoritarianism. So that's why I'm not quite so sure that fascism, while it's good shorthand for the most strident kind of authoritarians, I think that we're in a different place that might require different words.
So what about, it's no secret that Trump has plans to run in 2028. I mean, he jokes about it all the time. The MAGA 2028 merch is already available online. We've seen the desk at the Oval Office was littered in these hats. In fact, recently, for those paying attention, we've also seen Rep. Andy Ogles, a Republican from Tennessee, introduce a resolution this year amending the Constitution to allow Trump to run again. How seriously do you take that?
Oh, I think you have to take it very seriously. I think that it gets back to the statistic that you cited at the opening, that 40% of Americans think that democracy is not working. That number needs to be broken down a little bit. There's a huge chunk of that 40% that thinks democracy is not working because democracy is illegitimate. We need to do away with it. The people will automatically assume that it means, okay, well, democracy is under threat, we need to protect it. That's not what's going on in the United States. There are plenty of people, I would say that maybe half of that 40% are people who think that democracy is no longer, and this gets us to an historical point, that democracy is no longer a worthwhile effort.
So where has this come from, Tad? Is this organic? Because we have to also factor in that there's been a lot of efforts. We have seen, attempts to influence elections in other parts of the world. We know that disinformation is rife online. I mean, do you think this is organic, that there's a growing number of Americans that somehow want an authoritarian leader?
No, of course not. No, I don't think it's organic. I mean, I think that it's orchestrated. But this idea that you need to destabilize the West in order to make sure that that resources are in the hands of a few in order to enrich themselves. I don't think there's any, while there might be an ideological component to each of the individual countries in which this is working politically, and that's mostly through ethno-nationalism in the United States and Britain and Canada. We can see that everywhere, but that's how it's working on a political basis. When we see how it's working in terms of the way authority is being organized and deployed, this is really about power being accruing in the hands of a few to achieve some very narrow interests that essentially serve their own group. And that's why a kind of regime-based authoritarianism benefits from all that, and that's why why Putin just joys in destabilizing the West. Fine, it's a slow day. Let's send drones over Denmark and Germany, and let's throw the European skies into a bit of a tizzy to show that we can destabilize you whenever we want. Let's go ahead and make sure that people going to airports can't get on their planes that day. This idea to be able to keep the West unstable, so that you can continue to go ahead and accrue and deploy this kind of narrow set of interests at the top. That's a lot of work that needs to go into that. But that is what we kind of see that's going on. But the United States, to kind of get back to your bigger point about whether it's organic, it fits into a story about American nationhood, that America is not created as democracy. America is created as a republic. And this ridiculous online discussion about people who are saying, well, no, America's a democracy, America's a republic. It's disgustingly tiring, because it misses the point. America was created as a republic in order to accrue a great deal of power in the hands of a very few who had particular characteristics that enabled them to be the natural leaders of that society. That is a sign of them being men of their time, or actually being these great men who were there at a particular moment. And of course, they were going to lead everybody else down this wonderful long road to ever-increasing freedom. Well, none of that's true. But in any case, that story that America begins as a republic is a part of this massive narrative that democracy doesn't work because America was not created as a democracy. It was created as a republic to put the hands in a few white guys. And so naturally, we need to return to that government. So exclude more people from voting. Everything that happened to that is unnatural. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, the expansion of women's rights, Roe versus Wade, all expanded political authority to people within the American system who were not included in that system. You want America to become great again? And this is what Mike Johnson gets to, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, his kind of nationalism. You want America to be great again? You remove all of those expansions that happened after the Civil War. And that's what they're doing.
Well, speaking of a few white men in power, we're seeing an increasing number of officials in the White House now who have been awarded positions with no qualifications or public mandate. And I think the public mandate is probably the important bit. Hegseth, a political commentator on Fox, who was also accused of assault, was called the least qualified nominee for Secretary of Defense in American history by a fellow vet. Elon Musk, as we know, ran an entire department, Dodge, without a single ballot being cast in his favor. Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, is seemingly acting as a U.S. negotiator in Israel. Where does this acting of non-elected officials fit into this picture of authoritarianism?
It's the best evidence that we are in a post-democracy world. They don't care. That their level of legitimacy doesn't come from what the assumption was before, is that it would come from, in some way, from the authority that they get from the consent of the governed, that they have a share of that authority. When you reject that authority as being a legitimate claim to power, and when you talk about, well, what are they qualified to do? Well, they're qualified to serve the interests of the regime. And that's what we see to be common in authoritarian regimes everywhere. Your only qualification is your loyalty to the regime. And
so you're calling the Trump administration the regime now?
Oh, absolutely. I think that is being precise about it. That it is a group of people that exist on a number of different levels, inside layers of government and outside, that are all acting in concert over a long period of time to exert power and authority and accrue all of those authorities of the public to deploy for their own purposes. I think that's a fairly clear identification of any kind of regime. It can be a good regime, it can be a bad regime, but it's still a regime, and it's got particular characteristics to it. And I think that's a more clear way to think about it. That way, we're not assigning this agency solely to Donald Trump. I think that's a huge mistake. That we understand that this is part of a broader movement, but a movement is too amorphous a word. A regime is about authority structures and about the exercise of power, and making sure that we're understanding that power isn't just what happens within the structures of government, but happens within cultural structures and business structures outside of it, but all still acting in concert with one another. And that, I think, is what we're seeing.
Well, speaking of regime, the U.S. Army just swore in 4 tech executives as lieutenant colonels. You're a vet yourself. Mm-hmm. They included the CTO of Palantir, the CTO of Meta, OpenAI's chief product officer, and the former chief research officer. These untrained civilians were leapfrogged over 16 ranks of trained officers in the military. Now, we've already heard that Palantir's got huge access to data from Dodge under Elon Musk's watch. We've already seen the tech bros, the same ones harvesting our social media data, interfere in government affairs. How do you interpret the presence of these men now in military ranks?
Well, I think that it's absolutely the consolidation of that idea that these governmental tools exist only as tools for themselves. That when we think about they have no legitimacy, they have no background, that they are being appointed to be senior officers in the United States military, representing these other interests, again, is more clear evidence about how the folks in charge see all of the tools of the government at the disposal to serve their own ends. And Steve Bannon has said this, so this isn't coming out of nowhere, that he's been very clear about this, that once you get in, then you use every tool at your disposal to make sure that the entire system can be adapted to last for generations, to achieve your goals in ways that cannot be rolled back. Then this is exactly what you do, because it works on the other side too. You appoint guys like that. But even more recently, over the last 2 weeks, we have seen a number of senior officers in the United States military, the Navy, and the Marine Corps resign as a result of the foolishness that Hegseth and Trump did at the Defense Department, sort of calling all the senior officers over for that pageant. But in the wake of that, it sent a very clear message that you're either with us or you're against us. Get out. And a number of them are getting out, and they're getting out loudly.
If you're enjoying the show, why not join our Patreon community? The Tea is more than a YouTube show. It's a space to foster meaningful change together. By becoming a member, you're supporting that mission. And if you join our top tier, you'll get exclusive ad-free episodes too. So join us now, link in our bio. Let's talk specifically about the types of individuals that I've just listed. They're the head of tech companies that are involved in profound, surveillance. They tend to have visions, ideologies that subscribe to a type of ethno-nationalism that veers towards eugenics. These are people who are now in control of military positions whilst holding views of the world that are at odds with the democratic structure that they're supposed to be protecting. I understand the point about them being unelected, but surely who they are is even more concerning.
Yeah, and then you can throw in Larry Ellison and the sale of TikTok into that. That because he's with Oracle, he envisions an America and a world in which everybody is under surveillance. He's said this publicly, is that a more stable country, a happier country is one in which everybody is under surveillance. Because if everybody is under surveillance, then they are behaving in more acceptable ways because they're being watched. He said that not long ago, and he is now going to be the owner of TikTok. This is the kind of these folks who, and which is entirely orchestrated by the White House, in order to be able to put exactly the people you're talking about in these kinds of positions. And that's the reason why we can't assign too much agency to Donald Trump in having a worldview that really considers the kind of society by tech bros that to be able to envision what that means socially and what that means politically on a global scale. However, the other folks in the regime absolutely do. Because this is the way to go ahead and exert authority in the most clear way that makes lines drawn on a map, the old idea of the nation state, almost irrelevant.
What are the actual implications of these guys being in these positions?
The main implication is that they have access to all of the networks of control that wouldn't necessarily be accessible to people who were civilians. And because the most sophisticated surveillance networks in the United States are all as part of the national security apparatus. If you turn the national security apparatus, which is the most sophisticated in the world, to the goals of this small group of technocrats, then, well, not just the sky, but the stars are the limit.
In a recent interview with Democracy Now!, the Canadian author and activist Naomi Klein said, and I quote, "Fascism is always an attempt by the right to resolve a crisis of its own era." What is the crisis of this era that the rise of fascism is reacting to?
There's what my heart says and there's what my head says. That one of the things that coming out of the fall of the Berlin Wall was this idea that all things would be better, that a world of growing complexity and growing diversity, of growing appreciation of the richness of diversity, of the value of diversity, of open borders, of an EU, of free flow, of a global market and of a global community seemed within reach. That this was the end that we kind of all wanted to achieve, and that all of the resources that were being deployed towards the Cold War could then be freed up to lead to development in Africa. Right. I mean, that we got, in fact, thought about that all of these resources could be put to all of these wonderful uses to improve the standard for everybody around the world, and therefore extend the benefits of democracy and of consent of the government.
This is the era of heal the world.
No, it is.
Make it a better place.
It is.
Try and sing the rest of it.
Yes. We should have a concert. Yes, but it was real, particularly if you're young at that time. It was real to think that there was that capacity. However, what that unlocked was a real fear on the people who had benefited from the previous system, that their power was under threat. That they would have to, in fact, particularly when you're talking about the military-industrial complex that even Eisenhower warned against, with that they would have to go ahead, in order to be able to maintain control, they would have to make sure that they would reintroduce a level of crisis that would re-legitimize their role and put everybody on yet another stage. And the great American freakout after 9/11 is what did that.
Yeah, and we had our own one, right? The 7/7.
Exactly, the 7/7.
The Bataclan.
And it happened at around the same time. We had about 10 years, which is why the music from the 90s is great, right? We had about 10 years of things being of being able to see a world that could be. And I know this is somewhat nostalgic, but I gotta go there, right? But the idea that the empire always strikes back, that the folks who were running out of their authority needed to establish a new rationale for their authority and then return to it like never before, the Patriot Act, and what happened after 9/11. And it is that fear, and that's the crisis. It is that fear, that persistent but increasing fear of the loss of that power, particularly through demographic change. I mean, and that is, I think, the big fear that they have seen and the crisis that they are reacting against.
Well, let's talk about demographic change, because it's the favorite subject of our far-right buddies up in power right now. Gen Z will be the last generation in America with a white majority, and it's predicted that by around 2045, non-Hispanic white people will make up less than half of the US population. This means that Generation Alpha, so those born after 2012, are projected to be the first majority-minority generation. Why does this demographic shift make some white Americans, so anxious?
Well, it shouldn't. And I think based upon the growth of what is so derisively referred to now as the woke culture, which is really just sort of an awareness of the richness and importance of diversity, I think, being able to more objectively evaluate it, that it shouldn't necessarily be a threat. That the idea that numerically, based upon somebody's measurement of your melatonin levels and your origin status, that is somehow a bad thing. These are value judgments, and these are culturally created value judgments.
But can we be honest about it? Because it is a shift. I think it is a threat. But I just think we have to be honest about the fact that there being a white majority in America has had political implications for white people that has favored them. And the idea that there's not going to be a commensurate shift in favor of ethnic minorities, which is feared by white people who've experienced privilege, I feel like it's not honest. I feel like we're not honest about this thing.
Well, no, I think that you're right. And I think that what's happened is that idea that it is on the one hand, is a cultural value that we cannot see as a threat, you're right, is a bit naive and is a bit nostalgic. Because what has happened is that the entire thing has become weaponized. And that is the more clear point, is that people being able to understand that it is, in fact, an absolute bad thing because it threatens their position. It's an entirely unearned position, but it threatens their position. And that is the domestic crisis. And you see that crisis being exported to the UK, being exported around Europe, because it is a very quick and easy way into those populist ranks, because you're able to create fear and you're able to create this sense of entitlement. And when you throw in this idea of the great replacement, like this is a conscious, articulated and deployed construct, rather than it being a product of other kinds of more natural forces, that this idea that it is not just not good, it is a terrible thing. It is a threat.
It's an existential threat.
It is by definition an existential threat.
And I think maybe that's where the white nationalists take it a step further. Is it a political threat to white supremacy? Undoubtedly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is it an existential threat to white people? Only if surely you think that other people have the same extermination, ambitions as you do, right?
Right.
Okay. So on that note, how do you make sense of the support that we're seeing from some minority communities, the Cubans in places like Florida? You've probably seen the very viral video of the far-right Texas political candidate, Valentina Gomez, who's originally from Colombia, burning a Quran with a flamethrower. She's also been very hateful about many other communities. How do you make sense of the support that we're seeing for this, America First, which is essentially a white America First agenda among some minoritized communities?
Well, what we're seeing is something that we've seen a bit in American history before, which is people being able to reach for a level of allyship, more fundamental consistencies that they can draw. And you see that mostly when it comes from, you talked about the Cubans, and we can talk about that, but when you see it come from folks who are the same part of the Christian nationalist communities. And you see a lot of that when it comes to non-white people, when it comes to Latinos, when it comes to Black people who are aligned with MAGA, they tend to be aligned on that level. with one of these other powerful strains that they can reach out to, where to them, because they buy into the rhetoric, that whatever kind of characteristics they hold that might run counter to the avowed principles of that movement, they see other values that they share as being greater. It tends to be a much larger group because people are not, they're not uniform. People do respond in different ways. But I think that for them it's phenomenological and we need to explain it. But I think that it can be explained. Again, we've seen this at other points in American history where they see a commonly shared interest to be much more important on a value scale than the things that they differ in, even if that is directly against the very clear statements that folks like Stephen Miller are making against their very existence too. They can reconcile that somehow.
I want to ask you about, clearly this is one of the points of alignment that we're seeing across many different American groups, some of which don't seem naturally aligned. What is the role of Christianity now in the rise and support for authoritarianism?
It's central. It's tough to call it Christianity. It's tough to think about it in those kind of theological terms, because this is a weaponized version of Christianity that is surprising even to people who study that there has always been an evangelical strain in American history, at least since the 19th century. But that has become so much more strident and in a departure from what could be seen as more mainstream Christian faith traditions. This is one that is bizarre even to theologians and scholars of religion today.
But what's its function? Why are we seeing this rise of this religious narrative alongside the rise of authoritarianism?
Well, because there seems to be an alliance there with this idea of millennialism, an idea that the end days are coming, and that there is a level of wickedness in society that needs to be addressed, but that essentially the millennium is coming, that Christ is coming, and so therefore the conditions for that need to be met, which is why evangelical Christians, and so Mike Johnson again is the best example of this, and the representative of this, the clearest representative of this, the aggressive representative of this within the regime, the Speaker of the House, that this alignment between the Christian nationalists and Zionism. That Zionism needs to accomplish its goals so Christian nationalists can achieve their goals so that the conditions for the return of Christ can happen.
But Tad, how do you organize politically against people who believe that they're literally out here fulfilling God's mission? And I say this because I think about it a lot in terms of how you debate, for example, with somebody who says, I want to ban abortion. And I say, for example, well, I don't think you should ban abortion because if, a teenage girl is raped or any woman is raped and she needs to get an abortion, that's maybe something we should be able to facilitate, and there's all sorts of other arguments we could make in favor of it before we even get to it's just a human right. But if the person in front of you just replies, God says so, where do you even go from there? And this doesn't just apply to abortion. This now applies to policy across the board. If God said so, how is any form of opposition supposed to even engage in discussion, debate, and political accommodation with these ideas?
You don't. You can't. That's where you get into Charlie Kirkland. You don't, because their idea of debate is just to go ahead and impose a view rather than to go ahead and engage in a discussion about it. There's no persuading people out of their set of beliefs, particularly when they are that strident in the way that they match policy. We saw this in the 18th century. And it's interesting having a historical perspective on this, with the idea that we need to go ahead and build guardrails around reason and around sense, particularly in our political life, if any kind of representative government can exist. We cannot debate with people who are hearing a voice in their head that's telling them to do something else. We can't debate, because you're right, you can't debate that. But that is a conversation that happened in the 18th century. So if we can't debate it, then you can't be a part of politics. Then you got to be kicked out. Then you cannot be a legitimate part of what it is that we're trying to do. You can't hold office.
But don't they say the exact same thing about us? Don't they say you don't get to hold office, you don't get to run because you don't hear God's voice? Right. Do you see what I mean? This is where I come unstuck, is that the same argument they can make from their framework of reference about us. You don't believe in the Christian God, you don't believe in his revelation, so you don't get to have a position on policy. And we're saying, because you do use that reference, because you do believe in this to be the word of God, you don't get to have it. Like, how do these two things coexist?
They don't. I don't think that they do.
So one of us has to impose on the other. I mean, at the moment, they seem to be winning this race.
Well, because there's no fight. I think that in terms of, and that fight doesn't have to be violence, right? What I'm saying is that there has to be an aggressive pushback using every means under our disposal to make sure that the broader message about what is really going on is in fact that it's a fair fight. Right now, you're right, they are winning on all of these fronts. They are able to impose their will on policymaking around the globe without real check because there is no counterpoint. Because that fight can be a battleground of ideas, but right now that fight is very single-handed.
And it's also down to their tactics, right? So let's talk about those a little bit, because we'll all have seen these videos doing the rounds on social media. I saw one just recently of a Border Patrol agent violently arresting a 19-year-old man outside a convenience store in Chicago. People around were pleading with ICE, saying he's actually a US citizen. He just graduated high school, but the officers didn't listen. These tactics seem to me, and I'd love your view on this, to be deliberately fostered to generate fear. And when I watch them, I'm reminded of the sorts of paramilitary groups or types of organizations wielded by authoritarian regimes, right? The Gestapo and others that use tactics that were deliberately aimed at creating fear in the population. Are the types of tactics that we are seeing ICE using just the product of cowboys being hired to do a job that they've not been trained properly for? Or is this part of a deliberate strategy connected to fear?
I think it's part of a deliberate strategy connected to fear. And I think that's a product of understanding what's going on from a resistance perspective. That it's important for us to understand the nature of authority, understand tyranny, understand fascism. That's why Tim Snyder's book, Jason's book are really important. But what happens when people respond to that? What does that look like when things have gone too far? When that authority has been abused, and people want to push back against that authority, they want to resist. And it's not just about protests. It's not just about going out with a sign. It's about structurally, systemically taking a look at, in fact, how that authority is being abused and what do we need to do against that? What has worked? What has failed? And why both happen? What we see in what you're talking about is the actual deployment tactically of these symbols. And this is symbolic behavior in order to generate these visuals that will chill opposition. That will, when we talk about there not being any real opposition even to the Christian nationalists in that kind of battleground of ideas, it's because there are people who are afraid they're going to be doxxed, they're going to be attacked, they want to perpetuate that understanding and broaden it. They want to clearly show its nature, violence on the street, but they want to expand its scope. We can get you anywhere. We can get you in your neighborhood, and it will keep you from not just protesting you. It will certainly keep you from organizing. It will keep you from speaking out, and that is part of the toolbook of fascists, particularly coming out of the Third Reich. Anywhere this is how you put not just chill opposition, you just put it on ice.
What would you say to people who might push back and say, we've just seen the No King's Day protests or demonstrations or parades, depending on how you see them, 7 million people across America in different cities coming out, purportedly to oppose authoritarianism. Isn't that a sign that democracy is healthy and doing what it should do, Tad?
I think it's a sign of the exact opposite. I think it's the sign that, yes, there is grievance. It's legitimate. There is legitimate anger, and that anger exists in great numbers, and enough that 7 million people more will come out and rally for a day to give voice against it. That is important for developing a level of solidarity, for making people feel that they're not alone, to be able to show abusive authority that there are people who are watching. The problem with it, and this is a major problem with it, as a part of resistance, is that it doesn't do anything more than that. Abusive authority just outweighs it. It always does. It will go ahead and deal with it, ignore it on Saturday for the most part, and then come back and get back to what they're doing on Monday, because there is no tail to what's going on Saturday. That's the big problem with it. There is no organized opposition in the United States. They're happy with the optics of a rally on Saturday, no kings. What do we do with that on Monday? There's no direct call to action. There's no articulated grievance. Even coming out of these protests on Saturday, there was no clear line of even what people were against. Even the coverage was talking to 10 people, giving 10 different responses about what they were opposing. And the calls to action coming out of all this were all steps to go ahead and reinforce the status quo, reinforce establishment systems. Vote blue no matter who. There was no targeted decisions about strategically what you need to do to push back against this regime. And in that case, opposition doesn't even form, much less coalesce. It comes down to this. The function that protest serves in resistance, is it a pressure release or is it a pressure creator? These are releasing pressure because it's being built up within people who are angry about what's going on. So they need to get that out, and it's giving them their opportunity to do that. That serves the authority, because then they can just go home and be comfortable and then get up the next day and, read the paper and go to the movies or binge watch Netflix. They can do that and still feel okay about what's going on until the next time they get mad. For resistance, that needs to turn into a pressure creator. It needs to be perpetuated. It needs to be persisted. The Gen Z protests we're going on right now are wonderful examples of what might be possible. But if you're going to go ahead and hold a rally for 2 hours in places where people aren't allowed to go ahead and be very clear on their signage or in any kind of demonstrations about what they're against, and there are no real calls to action about what they should do with it, well, you can no king all you want. That's still making an argument about what happened in 1776 and not what you need to do in 2025.
And of course, the response to those protests itself was quite something. We saw Trump release an AI video of him wearing a crown and flying a fighter jet emblazoned with King Trump, dropping what appeared to be sewage bombs on American protesters. Vice President J.D. Vance also posted an AI troll video on Blue Sky, a site that's very popular with liberals. In it, prominent Democrats knelt as supplicants in a royal court before Trump, the divine and absolute ruler. I wish I was making this up, Tad, because it's wild. What exactly is the administration thinking? Contempt
for the American people. Contempt, absolute contempt for anybody who considers the idea of democracy to be of value. Anything that even, and in this particular context, that their demonstration is at all a threat against them. If it was a threat against them, there would have been a response. But they can in fact just demonstrate in this very sophomoric way their utter contempt for the American people in ways that within fairly recent memory would have, under the rules-based system, under the norms-based system, would have gotten them destroyed in American political culture. No, now it's celebrated by their cohort, the contempt in which they hold all other Americans.
But why, even if you do hold your public in contempt, why would you want to communicate that to them, Tad?
Because there is no accountability whatsoever, because you can show that you can. You have absolute control to be able to do whatever it is that you want. Again, it goes back to this kind of unilateral action. There now is no longer accountability in any form. Culturally, by pushing back against somebody in the political arena, you're going to lose the next election. We're going to call for your resignation. And maybe even get it. Those guardrails are long gone. And every time they do that, it's a demonstration that there is nothing that you can do about this. I can go ahead and post the most ridiculous AI video or the most ridiculous meme. Why? Because I can, because this is our country, because we own this show. We are running this joint. And the bigger point, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it.
But is there something even more nefarious here about the use of AI? Because a couple of months ago, after the murder of Charlie Kirk, there was a White House address that many people speculated online was AI. In fact, it even looked like there was a glitch in the video. And what AI does is it messes with our sense of reality, right? It messes with our understanding of what is real and what isn't. To what extent do you feel that the popularization of the use of AI by this specific administration fits into a wider pattern with regards to control of communication and even, I would say, altering of our understanding of reality?
I don't think that it just fits into it. I think it's a direct reflection of their core beliefs in it. As we know with all kinds of authoritarians, but particularly with the kind of fascism that Jason Stanley writes about, but particularly with all authoritarianism, they need to not just control the narrative. They need to control all the conditions that inform the narrative. They need to control all of the paths of understanding what's true and what's not true, which enables them to invent crises and then also invent solutions to those crises that they are in control of. The idea that you have an alternative way of understanding what is and isn't true that isn't coming directly from them is anathema to their way of doing business, to their fundamental organizing philosophy for how to gain and maintain their control on power. And so once they do that, they have to control your sense of understanding what reality is in all of its forms. So every way that you get it, and we understand the increased way that people are gaining their knowledge about the world around them from digital media. We know that clear. And for them to be able to go ahead and make sure that they are destabilizing what is true so that they can be the ones to tell you what is and isn't true, whether that's from vaccines or whether that's about foreign policy. They can control all parts of that narrative because it's the narrative, it's that story that everybody has to agree with, and they will impose it if they're not going to get there through persuasion.
Well, and we've also seen this applied to more what we would call legacy media sources. So the Pentagon's new media policy reportedly prevents journalists from publishing stories that haven't been approved by the Secretary of War, Peter Hegseth. In response, nearly all news outlets, and even Fox, in fact, turned in their Pentagon press credentials, releasing a statement saying that the move would restrict journalism, you don't say. To what extent does this specific move with regards to reporting on Pentagon activity run the risk of us missing out on really important information? Because I completely understand why these outlets have turned in their badges, but are we now also therefore missing out on an accountability of quite a critical space of government, the Pentagon?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, again, it enables them to go ahead and control that narrative because there is, I mean, the conditions about this were that they would not receive any kind of confidential briefings or information from anybody else in the Pentagon, the kind of sources that are the bread and butter of journalism, and that informed the press being that accountable pushback against the abuse of authority of any kind of government. It was able to hold them in check. It's why it's in the First Amendment. To be able to say, we don't care, we want to remove even the conditions that enable that check, the basis for honest journalism, because of the function of that journalism to keep us honest. We don't want to be honest. We're not going to be honest. We want to tell a story, and you're only going to go ahead and have the privileged access if you're a partner in telling our version of the story. Else now, you're going to have to go ahead and do what everybody else is doing and pick up the pieces, but you're not going to do it with our help. And I think when the history of this moment is written, I think that is probably going to be one of the more emblematic moments.
What would you say to people who are watching this who will say, look, democracy is under assault for sure, but we have solid institutions. Our democracies were built to resist these sorts of moments. We've always had kind of shifts in different directions. This will recalibrate. Our institutions will protect us.
I think that you're getting your history from a fairy tale. I don't think that any of that's true. I don't think that we have any evidence that that's the case. I think that what we have had, we have not had the kind of threats that these institutions are in fact now crumbling under. And that when people point to, I hear that all the time, when people point to in the first part that we have institutions that are whole, these kind of liberal nationalists that believe that the American Constitution, American institutions do have a kind of self-important gravitas that will enable them to bounce back, that will enable them to be restorative, reparative, aren't in fact looking at the fact that they are compromised, that they have collapsed, that Congress has in fact been rendered absolutely neutral in terms of its ability to check anything that this government is doing. that the judiciary, if you're able to game it properly, and because there are no guardrails built into the Constitution about the judiciary, none, zero, zilch. It's all about what they decide to do, what people agree on doing. It is about idea of precedent and statements that people will adhere to. Nothing that is in fact written down in the Constitution to uphold. That's not the kind of Constitution it is. It is a gentleman's agreement based upon the kind of club that they wanted to run. And if somebody that's in the club wants to run it to their own ends, they can. Those institutions have collapsed. And so when people say that, well, we have withstood these kind of threats to democracy, well, no, you have withstood threats from outside of the establishment to that democracy, not ones that in fact are within that establishment to democracy. And that's what's making this collapse, is that it's coming from the inside. And so I think that ends up, there is a level of naivete that is not just frustrating, but I think is dangerous. And I think that people are going to be very disappointed very quickly.
Some people might say Zahran Mamdani's recent primaries win, is an example of grassroots success within those very institutions. He's now, of course, in the thick of it, fighting to be appointed new York mayor. Is this evidence that you can fight this war from within the system, that we can fight back from within?
I think it's evidence that you can run an insurgency in the system. Not that the system works, but that you can use the system in order to accomplish your goals to the extent that it holds. In New York, what we're seeing in New York City, what we're seeing in the mayoral race are institutions that for the moment are holding. And that a democratic socialist can in fact take advantage of that system. And keep in mind that this is a vast majority Democratic city. We're not talking about one in which it's a battle between the Democrats and the Republicans. This is still a battle that's just on one side of the spectrum.
Got it.
And so within that, you have these institutions that are already there, that you have somebody with, I think, a unique set of leadership capabilities that Mamdani has. He is able to be exactly the kind of leader that a lot of people desperately want to see, but are only seeing in performance elsewhere. Gavin Newsom and J.B. Pritzker, they're performing opposition. Mamdani is actually doing what he needs to do, but being honest to who he is. And making no apologies for that, and showing what a benefit it is, showing that how that can work for a community, and you can stick to your principles and stick to your goals, and you can be articulate about it, but you can also be brave about it. I mean, how he's able to get out there every day to keep doing that under the kind of threats that he's getting is astonishing. The kind of bravery. It makes me think of Bobby Kennedy in 1968. That's the kind of energy that he's giving out, but also the kind of danger that he's in. But that he can represent this level of insurgency to be able to, before it's too late, rescue the system from itself.
How far off are we from it being too late, Tad?
I think the clock's ticking.
And so when we look at someone like Mamdani fighting from within, is the main route for resistance to this moment from within institutions, from your perspective?
At the moment it is. I think that but it's got to happen on both scales. I think that what happens with Mamdani and what happens in this election cycle, both the elections that are this year and next year with Congress, I think that that's going to reveal a great deal about just how compromised all elements of the system at the local and the state level are too, as well as at the federal level, to be able to see what in fact is holding. Because the problem that we're running into isn't necessarily what's going on in the hard right. The problem what's going on is on the center left, is on the establishment left. And we see that with Mamdani. We see that in the main Senate race. We see that over and over again when there are these insurgent candidates who are trying in a properly progressive way establish principled stands for the left within the existing system. What happens? The establishment left comes out to fight them. The establishment left brought out Andrew Cuomo, the Democrat. I mean, Trump did, but it's the establishment left that really wants them in there. I mean, it's happening in the main Senate race. You bring a 77-year-old governor out to run against the young progressive candidate because he's getting traction. No, you bring out Janet Mills. and you run her at a fairly late moment in order to get her in there, so the progressive has no chance. You get the establishment figure who, if she's elected, will be the youngest freshman senator in U.S. history, but she's the establishment figure. So the big problem that we're finding in the opposition in the United States, and this is the question that needs to be resolved, is for people to recognize or understand the extent to which the establishment left is as much of the enemy to any kind of reform, any kind of possibility for rescuing this.
You wrote in your Substack that resistance isn't about speeches or symbolic opposition, but about direct action, operating without permission, forcing abusive authority to spend its energy, holding on, and accepting that success isn't guaranteed. Mm-hmm. Are you saying that it's time for people to accept that they will have to come up against the force of the law?
Yes. Absolutely.
People have to get arrested.
People have to get arrested. All resistance, in order to in fact get going, in order to make sure that abusive authority will pay attention, involves risk. Risk of what? Risk of loss. And all resistance depends upon that one question. What are you willing to risk? And how much? It's the nature and scope of that risk. And without it, there is no meaningful opposition. This is one thing that I go through in my book about the anti-slavery resistance, to be able to understand resistance dynamics. The level of frustration that people like Henry David Thoreau saw with moderates who just argued for reform and for appeasement and for compromise with the abusive authority that was consigning 4 million Americans to live in brutality, was perfectly fine with enabling the perpetuation of that abuse, as long as they remained comfortable and they didn't have to risk their own place in the establishment. The level of frustration that people like Thoreau and others had with that acceptance, there is already the violence inherent in the system. There is already the violence that was being deployed by the United States government in the Mexican War, and then in the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and then the Dred Scott decision, and then on the floor of the United States Senate when Preston Brooks went and beat the hell out of a United States senator without any reaction. That recognition that unless they stepped up what actual resistance meant, then this would never end. The oppression would never end. It was going to continue in perpetuity because there was no reason for it to end since they had captured all the authority of the federal government. That's why you support John Brown.
I hear you on this. My one major concern here is that we're talking about a country where a third of adults own a gun. There's an estimated 433 million guns in America. And let's be clear, Republicans own twice as many as their Democratic counterparts. Not that I'm sure that the lines in the sand are clearly Democrat-Republican, but I'm just pointing that out. Do you ever worry that this could just be a recipe for civil war, which America does also have kind of a history of?
Yeah, I don't think it's a recipe for civil war. I think that right now the level of opposition in the United States doesn't have the taste for that. I think for there to be a civil war, people would have to shoot back. I think that right now there's no real meaningful organized opposition that people would be willing to in fact do that. All of the violence is on one side, and that is a desperately dim view of things when we think about those dynamics in the United States today. That yes. First, we have to understand that violence doesn't necessarily have to result in physical violence. What you have to do is be able to accept that as a possible outcome. That's the leap that you have to make. Is not that you want to embrace that, not that you're going to actively choose that as being your tool. What you do is that you have to accept that as being a consequence of how you need to resist, how you need to push back, how you need to refuse the authority. Because until you do that, abusive authority will never recalibrate. They'll never start counting their own costs and think, well, maybe we need to do this another way.
So what does that look like concretely, though, Tad?
Well, we've seen it at a micro level in things like a couple of months ago in LA for the protests against ICE. There were actual physical pushback. People were not moving. And so what did ICE have to do? They had to pause. They had to pull in more ICE. They had to pull in National Guard troops. They had to start expending resources, changing what they were doing and how they were doing it. The problem is that you can then just wait it out. That's got to happen at scale. That's where you go into organized opposition. Had that started happening in city after city after city, and more resources have to be deployed and more ideas have to go into how, in fact, our plans for engaging in this kind of violence against the American people are working, we then have to go ahead and recalibrate to that. There is no recalibration going on, but there in that one moment, for just a couple of weeks, you saw the potential for what could happen. And that wasn't people who were going out there, throwing Molotov cocktails at ICE. That were people with rocks and shields deciding that they're not going to go anywhere. That's resistance by definition. You have to make them change their course. Now, but in doing that, you have to accept you're going to get hit. You're going to get knocked down. You might have to swing back. That is the point that you have to accept. You don't have to sort of embrace the ultimate end, but you have to embrace the possibility that that might happen. That's the only way you got to do it.
In the UK, we're seeing the imprisonment of many in support for Palestine action, and increasingly also a lot of retirees, people 70 and above. And so it's hitting that middle that has never actually had any trouble with the law, has never seen itself inherently as opposed to the system per se, suddenly being on the front line of that system. Tad, is the confrontation now inevitable?
Well, nothing's inevitable. I think that it's important to make it inevitable. I think that it's important to draw that line. That's why we talk about things in resistance dynamics, such as strategic provocation. The moments that you're talking about with Palestine action, with the older people being arrested, people need to see that. People need to know what the nature of the abuse of authority is. You need to push those moments. It happened in the American Revolution. Samuel Adams understood this, which is why he engineered the Boston Massacre the way it happened. He needed the point of strategic provocation to show the abuse of authority of the British government, to be able to use that as a broader tool to show what was really at stake. You need that. Now, it doesn't have to involve, as in the case of the Boston Massacre, 5 people getting killed. 20 people getting arrested can make the point, just as well. But you need those moments of strategic provocation to make that very clear message about what really that regime is like. Expose them in all their nakedness. They need to be able to be shown to the people who have 10 seconds of vision time to be able to understand exactly what's at stake, exactly what's possible. And that's why some of the most powerful images we have throughout resistance history are moments when that happens. Moments when somebody is struck, moments when somebody is taken into custody, moments when somebody is released from custody, those kind of things.
So final words, what is absolutely essential for people to understand about where we are today and their role in resisting this moment?
This is absolutely a moment that is unique in history. Not in all history, but is unique in most histories, that people will think about moments that they go through that matter in terms of the trajectory of the world. This is one of those moments. And in doing that, this is about essentializing things. Know what it is that you believe in. Do you believe in democracy? What's that mean to you? And you'll be able to understand that, to identify that, to be able to clearly say, do you believe in pluralism? Do you believe in democracy? Do you oppose authoritarianism? Know what these words mean and where you stand on that, because where you could stand on that, you're going to be able to draw a line and figure out how far you're willing to go and how far you're not. And that is where all resistance starts, and ends.
Tad, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Myriam.
Thank you. Thanks for tuning in. Here at The Tea, we're not here to tell you what to think. We're here to open up space for ideas that matter. If this episode made you stop, question, or rethink, hit subscribe now and share it with your friends. You can also join us on Patreon for ad-free episodes, behind-the-scenes extras, and a hand in shaping what comes next. Independent journalism survives because of listeners just like you. So thank you for helping us keep the mic on and the dialogue real. Until next time, stay awake and keep connecting the dots. Thanks for tuning into The Tea. If this episode resonated with you, drop a comment and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And why not dive into these other episodes we think you'll love? Let's keep the conversation going.